Okay, sorry everyone for my awkward staring at the computer. I lost the chat, but now I found it. As you all are joining, if you would like to put your name and where you are based out of in the chat. That way we can kind of get an idea of where everyone is logging in from. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Evan. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for Coalition Snow. I think I've seen some of you in years past on various backcountry betas. Sorry, I'm trying to keep an eye on who's joining and who's already in. Okay, hey Heather. I'll just go ahead and put mine in the chat. Ooh, Colorado. I am also in Colorado. Janice. And Heather. We got Seattle. Portland. Yay, all over the place. Amazing. Yes, my name is also Evan, despite if it shows up as Jen Gurecki. Cool. Utah, Oregon, Park City. Amazing. Sweet. Okay, well, it is it's 2 minutes after 6. I'm sure people are going to be joining throughout, and so I will let people in as needed. Yeah, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Again, for those who are just joining in, my name's Evan. I'm based in Silverton, Colorado. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for Coalition Snow. We're a women's, oops, sorry about that. That was my mail, I think. We're a women's owned and operated ski and snowboard company based in Reno. And we've been doing backcountry beta for 4 years now with True Gear. And I'm really excited to be doing it for another season. We bring free information to women, non-binary, femme, and other gender expansive folks to help bridge the barrier to getting into backcountry travel and accessing that information in a safe space. So as we're on this call, if you all have any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll keep an eye on that. And yeah, just keep yourselves on mute. You're all on mute, which is awesome. But if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I will keep an eye on that. And so that we can get going, I'm going to hand it over to Jess from True Gear.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, I'm Jess from True. I also use she, her pronouns. And if you're not familiar with True, we're a small ski and snowboard outerwear brand based in Portland, Oregon. And I'm excited to pass the microphone to my home Avalanche Center for Oregon and Washington, Northwest Avalanche Center. We have Chloe Donlan joining us tonight for this Avi awareness class. Welcome, Chloe.
Yay, thank you so much. I'm Chloe. I'm here on behalf of the Northwest Avalanche Center. I have been recreating in the backcountry really since high school in the winter, but definitely with much more ferocity these last 6 or 7 years. My primary mode of travel in the backcountry is on skis, and I primarily recreate in the backcountry with my dog. So I'm happy to answer any questions throughout this presentation, but I'm always happy to talk about like recreating safely with pets or with dogs, skiing, etc. This presentation is put on by the Northwest Avalanche Center, so parts of this might be slightly more specific to the Avalanche Center. We'll pull up the NWAC website at one point and look through that forecast, but it looks like we have folks from all over, which is great because all of this information is applicable to you no matter where you live, what Avalanche Center is your home Avalanche Center, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and screen share with you all. Can everyone see my screen? Perfect. So the first thing I'll have you all do is just take 2 minutes, go ahead and check in using this QR code. This really helps Northwest Avalanche Center keep track of how many people take these courses. It allows us to follow up with you regarding upcoming education activities, seminars, events that are being put on. So really appreciate it if everyone could just quickly scan the QR code and check in with us. I'll pause briefly while you all scan it. Great. Okay, so we're going to cover some basic concepts in this class. It's a 60 to 90-minute class. We cover a lot in this period of time, but not comprehensively, right? So the 4 main topics I'll cover: avalanche basics, how do I know if there's a risk if avalanche is where I want to go, how do I avoid terrain, and then because this is a lot of information but not everything there is out there, the last thing I'll cover is what's your next step after this presentation. Where do you go if you want to get more information? What are your resources that are available to you? What do you do if you do or do not want to engage with avalanche terrain? Thank you all for introducing yourselves in the chat. I really like to understand too what mode of transportation folks like to use in backcountry. It'll help me answer questions or like tailor parts of the presentation as we go through. So if anyone feels comfortable, I would love just to see come through in the chat, like, do you ski, snowboard, splitboard, snowshoer, snowbiker, mostly just recreating through meadows, maybe with like pets or with your family. It's always really good for me to know. Snowmobilers. Awesome. Splitboarders, skiing with dogs. Cool. Okay, thank you for doing that. We have a good array of backcountry travelers here tonight. So the first thing we'll cover is, what is an avalanche? An avalanche is a potentially life-threatening hazard that can happen on snow-covered slopes. The definition of an avalanche is about as basic as it gets. It's snow falling down a slope. That happens because snow is not uniformly distributed on the ground. I really wish, and I'm sure any winter aficionados on the call wish you could just snap your fingers and like all of a sudden fall would change to winter and we'd have this beautiful, magical, perfect snow-covered landscape in the mountains. But unfortunately, that's not how it works. So the snow is not uniformly distributed. It falls in different layers. This photo is an example of an avalanche in the backcountry that has occurred naturally. Avalanches can also happen at the base of ski resorts or in the mountains where humans may not think that there's going to be a risk of one. This is something that we call a roof avalanche. So if you've ever gone to your favorite lodge or Paradise Mountain, or even sometimes you'll see like ropes roping off the edges of buildings that say like don't cross. That's because snow can actually avalanche off of roofs. Avalanches can also occur over highways. I've gotten stuck on I-90 and Snoqualmie Pass here in Washington State, really close to Seattle. I've gotten stuck 3 times already this winter because of roads closing for avalanche mitigation. And another example where slightly more rural of an area, but you can see an avalanche has occurred in the background there and it's covering a road. Okay, we're just getting into the definition of avalanches and the basics, and suddenly I'm showing you a photo of cake. Why am I doing this? This is to help illustrate that that snow, as it falls in different storm cycles throughout the winter, is falling in really distinct layers. And those layers don't always get along or talk to each other. So you can think of each layer of that cake as a layer of snow, and those layers of frosting separating them, that's where those layers of snow really try to bond with each other. A more scientific example, depending on what type of person you are, you can see here in this illustration, there's like the ground layer, right? Maybe the first storm comes in of the season, it's really cold. Then there's a week of sun. In Seattle, I would love that. However, sometimes another storm will roll in, it'll be warm and heavy, maybe a day between storms, cold, a long dry spell, and then cold and big. So we have all of these really distinct layers that are being impacted by weather and time forming. And I try to think of all those layers as like holding hands. I don't know if you all can see me. I think of them all like trying desperately to hold hands, and some bonds are stronger than other bonds. Some bonds are really weak. So a trigger, hold on to that word, put a pin in it because we'll come back to it. A trigger comes along and disrupts those layers of snow, and that's how we end up having an avalanche. I'm not sure how well you can see the layers of snow in this photo on your computers or devices you're using at home, but in this photo you can see, or you in theory should be able to see, a couple different layers of snow. Maybe this one is better, so you can actually see where that very top big chunk of snow has started to fail on a really common weak layer, and then a little bit below that there's a crust. The good news is that you don't ever have to identify unstable snow. Later in this presentation, we'll look at how to find the avalanche forecast. So we've defined what an avalanche is, and now we can start to talk about where they happen. Those avalanches need to be set off by a trigger. That's the word I said we're going to come back to time and time again in this presentation. A trigger can be natural, so think rock fall or a cornice setting off an avalanche. A trigger can also be human, and that's what we most commonly deal with or have to think about when we're recreating in the backcountry is ourselves. So in this photo, you can see this, I think it's a person on skis, has actually triggered this avalanche starting to form on this slope. Where can avalanches happen? They can occur on and also below steep slopes. So any slope that's steeper than 30 degrees has the potential to avalanche. In this photo, you can see the start zone of an avalanche, right? That's where the avalanche begins. And then the track where the avalanche travels through, and then the runout. The runout is the zone where the avalanche ends, and all of that debris, snow, big heavy pieces of ice, sometimes rocks, trees, branches, all of that debris gathers in a runout zone. So one of the things that'll be really important when you're planning your route or planning your day out in the backcountry is to make sure you're aware of the runout zones. I think that's something that really commonly people forget because those runout zones often are not on slopes steeper than 30 degrees. So you want to be super conscientious of the slopes above you and how they could potentially impact your travel. Avalanche path sizes and shapes vary. Those are also not uniform. So in this photo, you can see what looks to be an aerial shot of quite a big avalanche that has occurred. And this photo, before I click forward, maybe just take a couple seconds to yourselves and start to think about where in this photo an avalanche might be likely to occur. For me, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but for me, I immediately think of these big areas, right? These big ridges up at the top that look super, super steep. But looking only at that really big, sizable terrain can sometimes force us to miss tinier areas, like in the lower left of this photo, where there's also really steep slopes and potential for an avalanche path to occur. Same thing with this photo, right? Like I immediately look at those really steep mountains in the background of the photo, but there is some avalanche terrain in the foreground too. One of the signs you can look for is, are there really big, healthy looking trees? Those trees in the foreground of the photo don't look like they've ever been hit by a big avalanche in the winter. They're strong. We don't have little tiny seedlings poking through. We don't have trees at a 45-degree angle from previous avalanches. So sometimes that's a good indicator. We'll talk about more signs too later on in this presentation. Terrain traps, keep a hold of this word too. They can make getting caught more consequential. So something else to consider when planning your day out is whether or not you're traveling above or through any potential terrain traps. An example could be cliffs and rocks. One of the only things that could make getting caught in an avalanche worse than being in an avalanche in the first place is getting carried over a cliff or a rock band. That would be super unpleasant. Another example is a gully. Gullies are commonly in the summer travel paths, right? Like trails for hiking and such might follow a gully up slowly to a ridge, but in the winter, following some of those summer trails or following along directly above a gully can be super, super risky if the slopes above you have potential to slide. What can happen is all of the snow from an avalanche, instead of continuing to fall through that runout track into a debris field, all of that snow can just get stuck in a gully. So you have a much more consequential, much deeper amount of snow that could potentially end up on top of you. Terrain that flattens really abruptly, it's sort of the same principle. All of a sudden, all the snow that's coming down loses its momentum and stops, right? So it just starts piling on top of itself and getting deeper and deeper. And then trees. There's two common types of avalanche fatalities. The first is asphyxiation, which is suffocation, and the second is trauma. Trauma means getting carried over rocks or cliff band. It means getting carried through trees and hitting trees. So just because you're in an area with a bunch of trees does not necessarily mean that that's a safe zone from avalanches. You have to think about both avalanches and the consequences of getting caught in one in a whole bunch of trees. Where can avalanches happen? I'm going to jump to another presentation really quick. So avalanches have 3 ingredients, and I may or may not pop quiz you later in this presentation. Those 3 ingredients are avalanche terrain, unstable snow, and a trigger. We can't control whether or not the snowpack is unstable. We can't control whether or not we're going to be a trigger as humans. We just will always be a trigger. So the one variable that we can control is avalanche terrain, and that's where we'll focus. So avalanches can happen on any slope steeper than 30 degrees, but they most often occur on slopes between 35 and 45 degrees. You can measure slope angles with a tool called an inclinometer. I don't own one. I don't know anyone who owns one except for some of our forecasters, avalanche professionals guides. So if you're not looking forward to potentially purchasing an inclinometer, if you have an iPhone, I'm not sure if Android has this capability, but the measurement tool or measurement app sometimes has, depending on what iOS you're operating on, has a similar slope angle tool. So you might be able to find an application on your phone that you can use to help tell. A common question I get is why don't avalanches occur on slopes steeper than 45 degrees? They can occur on slopes steeper than 45 degrees, right? I'm not saying that's not a possibility, but sometimes if slopes get too steep, snow just sloughs off throughout the season. So there's not a big of a risk of there being a massive, massive avalanche. Not to say it couldn't happen, but it's a common question that I get. So we'll just do a little bit of practicing, barring anything you cannot see in this photo, so only focusing on the terrain you can see in this photo. Do you think an avalanche could happen here? Go ahead and put your best educated guess in the chat. We've got to know. Yeah, great. Thanks, everyone. You are correct. No, this is a lovely looking meadow. This would be a great place to go and Snowshoe, if you're not wanting to engage with an avalanche terrain that day, I might take my dog up here and let her just run her sweet little Siberian Husky heart out if we're not wanting to go in the avalanche terrain. This is a great option, a little meadow like this. This one's a little bit trickier, but barring anything we cannot see, go ahead and put in the chat, could an avalanche potentially happen here? Yeah, we've got some yeses coming in, some nos. Yep, can't see the full area. Yeah, this photo is really tricky. So barring what we cannot see, this is not a spot where an avalanche could potentially occur. However, my gut says that there are slopes on either side of this group that are going to get steeper than 30 degrees. So it's an area you'd want to be cautious in. The other, yeah, potentially a run out area, potentially something above you. The other thing I like to call out in this photo is that it's snowing super, super hard. There's not that good of visibility. We don't know what's in that background that that person on the far left is pointing to. Maybe there's a really, really steep slope over there too. So a little bit trickier, barring, anything we cannot see. And this is sometimes terrain like this on low visibility days is where it's really helpful to pull out your phone, make sure you're still on the track you thought you were going to be on, make sure you're not off track, potentially getting into something that's 30 degrees or steeper if your goal is to avoid avalanche terrain. And then lastly, where in this photo can an avalanche happen? Pretty much anywhere along this back ridge, right? Like this photo is not somewhere or a location that I personally would go to on a day when I'm looking to avoid avalanche terrain. You've got those big slopes above tree line in the top right. You've got some big features, some cliff, rocky looking areas with small trees, maybe signs of previous avalanches in the foreground. We've got this really big gully, which we talked about a little bit ago, kind of in the center here. So maybe not the best location if you're trying to avoid avalanche terrain. Okay, last one, second to last one. Could an avalanche potentially happen here? You can go ahead and drop in the chat. Yes. Got some yeses. Cool. Thank you for participating. Yes, an avalanche can potentially occur in some terrain that you can see in this photo. Inside that red circle, that's a steep area that's prone to having slides. However, there is a safe way if you were out for the day and you wanted to safely recreate in the backcountry, you didn't want to engage with avalanche terrain, there is a safe way you can get all the way up to that peak because along that ridgeline is less steep than 30 degrees. So you could weave your way through the trees on the right side, get up to the ridgeline, have a really safe, successful day in the backcountry while still avoiding that area you might not want to be getting into. And then last one, could an avalanche potentially happen here? Got some yeses. Short answer is yes, absolutely. This photo along the main ridge is actually less steep than 30 degrees. So this looks like a super fun area to go ski, splitboard, snowshoe, snowmobile, snow bike, depending on your mode of transportation. But there's also some areas of what we call micro terrain along the left where that red circle is and along the right. Some of that micro terrain can make what you think is going to be a really safe fun, productive day in the backcountry more consequential. So it's always good to take like a visual lay of the land once you actually get somewhere, right? Because what you see when you get out there is different than what you see at home when you're looking at a map or you're reading a trip report online. It's always good to take a lay of the land and confirm visually which route you want to take down to avoid something like this micro terrain. I will pause really quick. I've just given a ton of information. Really appreciate you all participating. Before we get into these two different types of avalanches, are there any questions so far? I've been trying to keep an eye on the chat. Maybe there's not. I'll keep going, but if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat as I keep going, okay? So there's two different types of avalanches that we'll cover today. The first is a slab avalanche. This occurs when strong layers of snow develop over weaker layers of snow and break loose from the surrounding snowpack. So think of that layer cake again. We have those really deeper layers of snow that can potentially have like weak hand-holding bonds between them. These slab avalanches are very distinguishable. They look a bit more, I'm thinking of like holiday cookies still. They look more like cookie cutters. So you can see in this photo, it looks like someone just stuck a cookie cutter in the snow, right? And like pulled it down, pulled it out. You can see along the top part where the avalanche started, you can see what's called a crown. And I'll use that term a couple more times in this presentation. A crown refers to the very top part of an avalanche. Here's another example. This is a close-up of a crown, and you can see how deep that avalanche occurred based on this person's ski pole. Slab avalanches can be particularly dangerous because they occur on layers of snow that we can't see from the surface. We don't necessarily know what's going on beneath where we're walking or skiing or recreating. The second type of avalanche we'll cover today is a loose snow avalanche. These occur when weak, cohesionless snow on the surface starts to move downhill. That weak snow on the surface starts to pick up slightly more speed and more snow along with it as it travels down, and it begins to form more of a teardrop shape. So these more commonly occur on the surface levels of snow where we can see them. Another example, this one's a little bit smaller. This one looks like probably some snow fell off one of those trees and triggered a loose avalanche. So that would be a natural avalanche. So we'll talk about how do you know if there's a risk of avalanches where you want to go now that you're familiar with the avalanche basics. Those avalanches have three basic ingredients. If we were in person, I would make someone volunteer to try to remember those three basic ingredients from that triangle I showed you, but I'm not going to do that because we are virtual tonight. So those three ingredients, right, is avalanche terrain, unstable snow, and a trigger. We can't control that we're triggers. We can't control whether or not the snowpack is unstable, but we can control whether or not we choose to travel through or engage with avalanche terrain. So how do you find out about the dangers of avalanches? We have folks from all over. So I'm going to pull up and have you pull up the Northwest Avalanche Center's website. But depending where you're coming from, I saw some people from Utah, Colorado. You have avalanche centers in your zone. British Columbia, NWAC forecasts for Washington and parts of Oregon, but not Colorado, Utah. So we'll look at the Northwest Avalanche Center's forecast. Yours will look super similar when you pull up that site to explore it in your own time. So to follow along on the Northwest Avalanche Center site, you can either scan this QR code, or if you're sick of using QR codes after the last few years, you can just type in either on your phone or on your computer, NWAC.us. Once you get there to NWAC.us, this should be the screen that you're seeing. I'll just give a couple brief call outs before we move to the next part of the presentation. NWAC has 10 different forecasting zones, so that forecasts are specific based on what parts of the Cascades you're in or you're considering recreating in, and you can see that the potential danger changes between zones. NWAC issues a new forecast at 6 p.m. every day. That forecast is for the next day. So it's 5:30 right now. the forecast that's on NWAC's website is for today. At 6 o'clock or at 6:30 tonight, that's when I would go to the NWAC website. I would call my friends. I'd say, the forecast is updated for tomorrow. Let's look at it. Let's look at the weather forecast. Let's plan out our route. A lot of avalanche centers operate that way. So keep an eye on your local center. It should say what time it's refreshed or when it was last refreshed.
Hey, Chloe, real quick, do you know which center might cover Oregon? I'm just seeing this question in the chat and I can check. I'm not sure what it is, if you don't know off the top of your head.
I know there is a center that covers the rest of Oregon, right? That's not Mount Hood, but I don't know what it is off the top of my head.
I'll do some digging. We'll try to figure it out, Maya.
Thank you. Okay. So once you have the NWAC website pulled up or your local avalanche center, if you want to follow along to whatever's local to you, go ahead and pull up a forecast for today and answer these questions. I'll give you about 5 minutes to do that exercise, and then we'll all come back and we'll keep going. So the question that just came through in the chat, can anyone see how to view yesterday's forecast? Most avalanche centers have an archive. Yes, thank you for sending that link. One of the really nice things I love about NWACs is that there's always an archive. So if I haven't been paying attention to the snowpack, maybe I had the flu for 3 weeks over the holiday season or something, and I need to dive back in, I'll go through the archives and read. That's a really good tool that you can use if you want more practice reading through forecasts that are local or regional to you, and see how the snowpack's been forming in your region so far this year. I'll give like one more minute and then we'll come back together and either answer some questions if you have any, or we'll keep going. Okay. I appreciate the questions that have been coming through the chat, but sometimes there's, yeah, some jargon or things you'll see in this forecast that might not make a ton of sense. I'm happy to pause if there are any questions. We have folks from outside of the Pacific Northwest, so I'll do my best to answer them for you. If you have any that are regional specific, but our rating systems, nomenclature variables, pretty standardized. Yes, the rating systems are super standardized. So low means low, low in Washington, low in Utah should just mean there's low danger. That said, obviously the snowpacks are very different from Washington to Utah. Sometimes Utah's lighter weight, so maybe I don't bring my Siberian Husky out with me. I think she's gonna like have a hard time swimming in it. It should be relatively standard across groups, across countries, from what I've seen, between Canada and the US, it's a little bit more standard. I did a ski trip in Japan this past winter, and it was not a standard forecast. There was no forecasting zone. We had a really hard time finding any information. We ended up going into a local shop to ask questions to the employees on what the conditions had looked like. So it can vary a little bit more if you get into some parts of Europe or Japan, but between the US and Canada, it's relatively standard. Yeah. I'm happy to stay on at the end and talk more specifically about resources for Japan if that would be helpful to you. But I won't make the entire group listen to me spiel about it. Are there any more questions about things you might have seen in your forecasts, terms that were used? Okay, we'll keep going. Signs of avalanche danger. There are 5 red flag signs that we should always be on the lookout for whenever we're in the winter backcountry. And these signs are not things that you can read or like know ahead of time when you read the avalanche forecast the night before. There's things that I always watch for every single time I go out. The first is wind. So if you can see snow blowing in the wind, it's likely that wind slaps are forming. That wind is depositing parts of snow in really specific areas. So if all the wind is blowing in one direction for the whole night, you got a whole bunch of snow moving to a specific area, and that snow didn't used to be there. So you've got a big slab of snow just sitting from the wind. In this photo, you can see wind blowing off. It looks like maybe a cornice is starting to form on this ridge. Same situation here up on this ridge line. You've got quite a bit of snow moving through the air. Warming temperatures. So warming temperatures, I'm not just talking about, oh, next week is going to be sunny in the Pacific Northwest. It's going to be slightly warmer than it was this week. I'm talking about rapid warming, like from the time you get out of the car until your first hour, your lunch break, until you return to the car, like rapid warming that occurs within the time that you're going to be recreating in the backcountry. Some signs of that occurring are roller balls. These are some big ones. I haven't seen one that big before, but they do exist. Melting. So if you're wet, if you're like out there and you're wet, you're getting wet, there's snow melting off trees, there's icicles dripping on you, there's snow falling in like down the back of your jackets, one of my pet peeves, that's a sign that there's some rapid warming occurring. I've seen this in the Seattle area. I hope our folks in like colder areas don't ever see this in like Colorado. But if you see like they're called runnels or rivulets sometimes, and that's big sections of water like running on top of the snow, that's a sign of rapid warming. And then also if it's just raining, like if you're at the trailhead and it looks like this, that's a sign that there's rapid warming occurring. Or if it starts raining while you're out, it's no longer cold, it's no longer snowing, it's raining, that's rapid warming. Heavy snowfall. Is it snowing more than an inch per hour while you're out? How do you tell if it's snowing more than an inch per hour? I wear a baseball hat when I tour uphill on my skis, and if I'm having to like brush the snow off the brim of my hat or it's falling in my eyes and I'm having to do that a lot, that's a really good sign that there's a ton of snow coming down. Another sign is if you're traveling, you're going uphill and you're having to work harder and harder and harder. You're in deeper and deeper levels of snow, but you're not gaining that much elevation. You've gained like 100 feet or 200 feet or something. You haven't gone up like 3 miles worth of elevation, 1,000 feet. That means there's a lot of snow falling across all elevations, like in a short period of time. Also, if it's snowing so heavily that you're just not having fun, like I've had days like that before, sure, snow is magical, but there's a certain point where it starts snowing so hard that it's just not fun anymore. That's a really good indicator for you too. Cracking, collapsing, and lumping. So seeing shooting cracks, feeling a really distinct settling between your feet and hearing a whoomp sound. Those are all signs that there's instability. This is an example of a shooting crack coming out from in front of this person's ski. Some more shooting cracks. And then finally, other recent avalanches. If you get out to your trailhead location, you start going uphill, or you start on your flat meadowy snowshoe, whatever you're doing for the day, and you see something like this, it looks like there was a ton of avalanches that occurred, either naturally or human triggered, right where you're recreating. That's a pretty good sign that danger is increasing. Depending where I'm going and how risky my route was, seeing something like this might lead me to question with my group whether or not we should consider turning around. So how do you avoid avalanche terrain? The only way to completely eliminate avalanche danger is to stay away from those steep snow-covered slopes. There's a basic process for avoiding avalanche danger, which we'll talk about. I want to briefly cover mapping tools and some options that you have. I'm not going to go in depth. This is not going to be like a whole mapping tutorial. There's some really great classes that are offered. If you do want to get more in depth on this subject, NWAC actually has one coming up. It's $100 and I think it's on, I want to say January 29th. It's on like winter orienteering and route planning. Another good resource in the Pacific Northwest, the Mountaineers have classes on like winter route picking and orienteering. There's some good online tools you can use. CalTopo is one of them. I like to use Onyx. Any mapping tool that allows you to add slope shading. Slope shading is really useful when you're planning out your route at home and it's an area you either have been, but it was the summer and you really weren't paying attention to avalanche danger before, or it's a new area you haven't been before. So when I apply slope angle shading to this region, this does not necessarily look to me like somewhere I would go if it was a day that I was trying to avoid recreating an avalanche terrain. This, however, maybe there's some areas that you could go if you wanted to go out with friends and family, or potentially like with pets and not engage with avalanche terrain. This photo was at Mount Baker ski area in Washington. Up at the top there, that's Heather Meadows parking area for anyone who's local to the Northwest. There's a lot of color in this photo too. And if I could zoom in, I would show you that if you go from that parking area, kind of follow that road up the ridge a little bit, that's actually a really common winter route for safe backcountry recreation. You could go down by those lakes a little bit without getting too far, in the run out zone potentially of the slopes on the other side of the lakes. So you have some more options. You can also see in this photo the chairs from Mount Baker, right? So you want to make sure you're not accidentally recreating or crossing into ski resort terrain. or depending on which resort you're recreating near, you want to make sure you're not doing it or crossing into parts of the resort where they're mitigating for avalanches, especially in the morning if you're getting an early start, because that can put you in potential harm's way. Okay, the basic process for avoiding avalanche danger includes assessing, planning, and reflecting. Assessing is everything we've just talked about. It's keeping an eye on what the weather is doing. It's going to the NWAC website or your local forecasting zone. You're looking at the travel advice. You're looking at the weather forecast. For me, I'm pulling up the I-90, like Washington State Department of Travel website, because I can't get stuck in Snoqualmie Pass again for a couple hours. It's just not going to happen. So you're assessing what are all the potential variables that you're going to incur that day. And then you're going to plan. You're going to call up your family or your partner for the day or your friends, and you're going to take a look at the local forecast together. You're going to talk about some routes. I usually like to have a couple different options for the day. Usually we have two, sometimes we have three, like a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. The plan A is based on everything you've assessed, based on the route you want to go or the area you want to go to, the route you're going to take. Maybe plan B is for if you get out there and you're seeing one of those 5 signs, right? Like you hear a woof, you see some cracks, it's rapid warming all of a sudden. You want to have a plan B so that you don't just have to turn around and drive home. You can stay out and choose not to engage in avalanche terrain at all. Maybe sometimes I also have a plan C, and that plan C, an example of that would be the avalanche conditions are always going to be what they've been in the forecast. That's not going to change. But maybe I've chosen a really conservative route because I'm going somewhere new and we're going to be socked in. We're going to have marine fog. I'm not going to be able to see where I'm going. I'm not going to be able to see what's above me. And then we get out there and all of a sudden the sun comes out and my Seattle self has not seen the sun in many months, and we can see everything and we feel much more comfortable making decisions to engage more heavily with avalanche terrain. So it's always good to have a couple different options in your plan. And then finally, reflect. This step is where I am trying to improve myself, because reflecting is what you do at the end of your adventure. You're back at the car, you've all made it safely, you're with your group. I'm tempted to skip it because I hate being cold, I hate being wet, I'm tired, the dog's wet and smelly, I want to go get a beer somewhere, a hot chocolate, I want to drive home, I want to take a hot shower, like I'm just done for the day. But it's really, really important to reflect with your group while everything is still fresh before you part ways, especially if you've all driven separately. This would mean saying, like, does everyone feel comfortable with the route we took today? Does everyone feel comfortable with the outcome from today's adventure? Does anyone feel like their voice wasn't heard enough? Did anyone feel uncomfortable with the route we picked but felt uncomfortable speaking up? That reflection is really important for managing your group dynamics and ensuring you can continue to be successful moving forward in the backcountry together. And what is your next step after this presentation? So what gear do you need to carry? What other skills do you need? And what resources are there? What skills do you need? Your next steps depend on what you want to do. You might have listened to this tonight and said, yeah, I think I want to avoid avalanche terrain. I'm not interested in getting an avalanche terrain. This just feels a little bit uncomfortable. Or you might say, like, yeah, I really want to engage in the terrain. I want to take my skis out this weekend. I want to go splitboard. I want to take the dog out with me too. You don't have to sit firmly in one or the other of these buckets. I fluctuate throughout the entire season. Some days I really want to engage in avalanche terrain. I'm feeling really good. I want to have a big day out. I'm feeling really strong physically. The weather's working really good. Some days I feel like I want to avoid it. I just had the flu for 3 weeks this weekend. I want to avoid avalanche terrain. I'm tired. I'm still not thinking clearly, but I want to go outside. I want to get fresh air. I want to take the dog out. So no matter which bucket you sit in, you can always fluctuate between the two. I saw a question come through. Perfect. Yeah, of course. We can definitely follow up regarding Japan resources. Yeah. So if you want to avoid avalanche terrain, there are activities that you can do that allow you to do so. So like snowshoeing in meadows away from avalanche runout, walking the dog on recreational trails, semi-urban settings, riding a snowmobile on the flats. If you want to avoid avalanche terrain, you still need to have these 4 skills. You need to be able to identify avalanche terrain in order to avoid it. So maybe it's worth considering taking one of those mapping classes so you can make sure you're never traveling through or directly underneath avalanche terrain. Map reading, of course. First aid, maybe it's worth it to consider a little bit of first aid. I took a wilderness first aid and a wilderness first responder. I thought they were fascinating, really good skills to have. I highly recommend. And then maybe just some general winter travel skills and safety. And if you're gung-ho, you really want to engage with avalanche terrain, you want to go take your skis out, you want to go winter mountaineering, you want to go winter climbing, you want to take your snow bike out, you need to have the same skills we just covered to avoid avalanche terrain, plus group management and communication. That's kind of what I just touched on, making sure everyone feels like their voice is being heard, you're engaging safely with the terrain. Avalanche rescue, I loved the AIRI course that I took. Felt it was super valuable, made some friends in that class, really fun class. You need to be able to understand the avalanche forecast, and you need to have a good risk management process. You need to reason with yourself, like at what point am I comfortable turning around? At what point do I decide I want to keep going? What's my tolerance for risk, and what's my group's tolerance for risk for the specific day or activity we're doing? And then what gear do you need to carry? Again, I'm not going to go super in depth onto all of these tools, but I do want to introduce them to you so you're at least familiar. If you're traveling in avalanche terrain, that's through avalanche terrain or under avalanche terrain, you need to carry rescue gear. You need to carry a transceiver, a probe, and a shovel. A transceiver, you might also hear this called a beacon. The purpose of it is to find the location of a person who's buried in avalanche debris. So those beacons, those transceivers, they have 2 modes. You turn them on and they transmit. That means they send out a signal. By default, they go into transmit mode. If you have someone in your party gets buried, they will be transmitting by default. And then you have the ability to turn your beacon, your transceiver into like find mode, and that beacon suddenly will search for that signal. So it's always crucial to carry one of these. A probe, that would be the next step after you've located or been located by someone's beacon. That helps you actually pinpoint the location of a person who's buried before you start digging. And then finally, you need to carry a shovel. I wish I didn't have to say this, but I always like to say that it's very important to carry an avalanche shovel. It's not just enough to get like a spade, a gardening spade, or like your shovel from your garage or something and bring it with you. Avalanche shovels are specifically designed and engineered to be really lightweight, but also really effective. They're designed to move a lot of snow, heavy snow, any type of snow in a short period of time. And any seconds, any minutes you can save by actually having an avalanche shovel and not like a little garden spade or something can be very crucial. And then you can take an avalanche rescue course to learn how to use this gear. Okay, we have quite a bit of extra time, so I'm happy to stick around. I didn't pause for questions for a while. Happy to answer any questions, talk through any resources people might want. The rest of this time is yours.
All this info was so great, Chloe. I just want to say that while people are putting questions in the chat, if you all have them. But this is so good. So thank you so much. Thank you, and NWAC. Yeah, it's really great.
Of course.
And I feel like a lot of people were asking during, but we will send out the recording so that folks can watch it again and reflect back on things. I was also just thinking about it as you were talking at the end that I'm not sure on you have a few resources there, but I was also going to put together a few resources for like there's so many scholarships now to help like help more folks get into the backcountry, specifically folks with historically marginalized identities, which is really, really cool. And so I was gonna send that out as well of extra resources. Um, let's see.
Awesome.
Okay, now we're getting a couple questions. Okay, do you have any recommendations on preventative actions to take when taking your dog into the backcountry?
Oh, that's a great question. I mentioned I have a Siberian Husky. She's 1.5 years old. This is her second winter skiing with us. So in terms of preventative actions, there's a couple things I say. I'm also not a dog trainer. So if you want more professional advice on this subject, there are dog trainers who specialize in these topics, or you could reach out to trainers who do like canine juring. It doesn't have to be on snow. It can be like, running with your dog pulling you or something, like people who specialize in activity type animals. But for us, being preventative when taking the dog in the backcountry means we're usually choosing less aggressive or intense routes. We're not taking her down couloirs or in areas that are super cliffy. She likes to chase animals, so we want to set her up for success if she does go off after something. I don't want her to, but I don't want her to be right next to a cliff if I drop the leash or something and she gets away from me. So we choose tamer routes. We also choose, generally speaking, shorter days because we tour up, right? And then we ski down, and the skiing down is fast, it's easy. Maybe you tour up 2 miles, it takes you 2 hours, and then you ski down, that takes you 10 minutes. Your dog is running that whole time. They're not getting a little bit easier of a path downhill on skis. I think it's really important to start your dog as early as possible, get them familiar with skis, get them comfortable around skis, snowboard, splitboard, any snowmobiles if that's what you're taking out. It's especially important to make sure your animal or your pet gives you space while you're going both uphill and downhill. I actually have a friend whose dog has stitches right now, is a herding dog, and he got too close he's totally fine. He got 2 stitches. But he got too close. He was trying to hurt our friend while they were going downhill. So really important to train them with that. And then making sure they're fueled really well. So making sure they actually eat breakfast before we leave the house. My dog is not food motivated. She rejects food. She's like a typical husky in that regard. So I have to force her to eat in the morning so she keeps her energy up throughout the day. And then carry more water, carry treats, carry snacks, make sure it's fun. And if you take your dog out, the last thing I'll say on this subject is like your animal's health and safety, they can't communicate with you. So just pay a little bit more attention to them and be okay with not reaching your objective for the day. When we were taking our dog out last winter, getting her used to it, there's quite a few times where we turned around, not at the summit or at the peak of a ridge or something, because she was starting to look tired. And we knew she had to get all the way back down to the car, right? Like not just up to the ridge and then easy ski out. So go out being okay with maybe potentially not reaching your full objective.
Thank you. Another question, how far do you have to be away from a slope to be considered not in or near or under avalanche terrain? It's a great question.
That's a super good question. And I will say that I think that depends pretty heavily on what your forecast looks like. So you might have seen in your forecast, there's potentially like different sizes of avalanches that can occur. If I'm in a really high danger type day, like considerable, the entire map is like orange or red, it's a really dangerous day to be out. I give those slopes more breadth. I don't want to touch them with a 10-foot pole. Like I don't even want to have to ask myself if I'm within a potential range. That's how much breadth I give them. If it's a really low dangerous day, maybe that day you have a bit more risk tolerance. You might be comfortable like getting closer underneath them. So I think that the question's fantastic, but it's hard because it toes the line a little bit into you and your entire group's comfortability with potential for risk. The other thing I would say too is like, there's no great answer for that because you might choose what you think is a good route that's not crossing through a run out zone or potential avalanche slide zone. But then you might get out and you might see one of those 5 signs, right? You might see like other recent avalanches that have occurred nearby. You might be seeing like those roller balls or something. And maybe you decide that you take your plan B route, your like slightly safer route, and you give potential slopes a bit more breadth.
Yeah, that is a tricky one to answer, but I feel like that was a good answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and then another question. If I'm understanding this one correctly, any recommendations for I think like the next step in avalanche training in the PNW, and that may be like an ARI course or companion rescue course, but if you could elaborate maybe a little on that.
Totally. I took what was called an ARI course, AIAO. It's in the bottom left of the screen. You don't have to listen to me try to spell it out. You can go to the avtraining.org and you should be able to find local classes. I took an ARI 1 and I'm going to take my ARI 2. There's sometimes offered like a 1-day rescue course or something that's more information than I've given you today, but it's not quite as many hours or as as time intensive as an ARI 1. You could take another one of these free courses and see if a different instructor gives you different, slightly more helpful information. Like that's a good option too. And then I think just like actually starting to get out, maybe you have like friends who have taken ARI courses, or you know someone who guides, or like a friend of a friend or something. I've learned a lot of continuing education by going out with friends who have more knowledge than I do. That's always really helpful. And that option is free unless you offer to like pay for gas or something. So lots of different options.
Amazing. Oh, got a question. Oh, question for all. What layers do you like to wear and bring with you in the backcountry? We actually did a Backcountry Beta last year, that you can find on Coalition Snow's YouTube page, that was all about packing, and it was very extensive because you'll find so many people have varying things that they like to bring. But Chloe, if you want to, or anyone in the chat want to elaborate a little bit on some of the layers that you like to wear in the backcountry. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Anyone who has tips, feel free to put it in the chat. I really like wearing smart wool, and my base layer tops have like little hoods on them because my head gets cold even with a baseball hat on. So I like to be able to pull that hood up, put a hat on over. I wear less layers than I do when I ski inbounds, but I have more layers with me, if that makes sense. My goal when I'm going uphill is to not sweat. I never achieve that goal. I always sweat, but I don't want to sweat so much that when I get up, I go to transition, I start skiing down, the weather changes or something, all of a sudden that sweat causes a chill, you're damp or wet and you can't get warm, you're really, really cold. So I wear less layers. I can always take some out of my backpack and put more on. Depending on the temperature, I might go uphill just in a base layer and a shell, or I might wear a base layer and a puffy and a shell. It depends on the temperature that day. Is that kind of helpful? Maybe. In the Pacific Northwest, I always wear Gore-Tex. In Colorado, I don't have to wear Gore-Tex. That's always like a nice treat, not having to wear as much of Gore-Tex there. Depends on your region and the temperature. I always bring 2 pairs of gloves. The gloves I wear uphill are not fully waterproof, and between managing the dog, dropping the leash in the snow and stuff, they're usually wet. So when I go up to transition to ski down, I like to have a dry, warm pair of gloves to put on. I always bring a second hat too. I told you, while I go uphill in a baseball hat, I always bring like a fleece hat or something really, really warm as well. That kind of touches into like general winter safety, travel guidance, stuff like that.
That's great. Thank you. And if anyone else has layer things, definitely put them in the chat. And then we have another question. Can you elaborate on how past days and archival forecasts inform your assessment of the current avalanche risk?
Totally. So past days and archival forecasts. So I usually do two things every single winter, but that's because we recreate in the backcountry a lot. So you don't necessarily have to do both of these two things at the same intensity level that I do. Not only do I read the NWAC forecasts every couple days more frequently if I'm going to go out, but I follow Northwest Avalanche Center on Instagram. I follow the Colorado Avalanche Center on Instagram. So I'm always sort of keeping tabs on what's happening with the snowpack. The avalanche centers will post on their websites and on their Instagrams too when accidents occur, and where they occur. I like to be aware of where, if that's happening and where that's happening. I have really low risk tolerance, so I don't like to direct rate in areas where there's been an accident or a big slide has been recorded. So I use both those tools and I use them really frequently. Where that becomes helpful for me is if, I'll give you an example from, I think it was like winter 2018 here in Washington State. We got like 3 or 4 feet of snow and then it was sunny for a month. Like, I'm not complaining because we rarely see the sun for that long of a period of time here, but it was sunny for so long that I knew we were going to have a really dangerous persistent layer because that sun had just baked that top layer of snow. It was an ice sheet. So for the entire rest of the season, any snow that fell on that, we were having tons and tons and tons of slides. Because I had paid attention to the snowpack throughout the season, I knew that persistent weak layer was there. I knew where accidents were occurring. I knew where people were submitting observations. You'll always see something like that reflected in the daily forecast, right? So like if you go into Snoqualmie and scroll down, if there's a persistent slab or I called it a persistent weak layer, that problem will always be stated. You'll never miss anything by not keeping an eye on everything throughout the season. I just like to know. I did the same thing if I'm traveling, like traveling to Canada, a trip to Colorado or something. I like to know what's been happening in those snowpacks. So I keep an eye on them because sometimes we choose to engage with riskier terrain.
Thank you. That was great. Does anyone else have any questions? I know a few people are dropping off, so just in case more people do, I just wanted to reiterate that we'll send out a follow-up email with this recording, and you'll be able to find it and access all these resources. Yeah. I don't see any more questions. Chloe, do you have any last things you want to say, share with the group?
I don't think so. Thank you all so much for joining. No matter where you're at, if this was a refresher for you or if this was more of a first step into understanding avalanche forecasts and terrain, I'm just so glad that everyone joined. I hope you got something out of this. Just get out there, enjoy the rest of the winter, find folks to recreate with. There's Facebook groups, there's local groups like the Mountaineers here you can go out with. Get out there and enjoy.
Thank you. And then I also just wanted to say that we have our next Backcountry Beta coming up. I have to look at a calendar. The 13th of February, February 13th. I think that's the second Thursday. Yep. And that is actually going to be a CalTopo demo and route planning. So we'll also plug that in our follow-up. But I just wanted to say that while people are still here. And thank you so much, Chloe and Jess from True Gear, for making this happen. And NWAC, it is really awesome to have these resources shared and have this be like a first step into learning about the backcountry and dipping your toes in. So it's very cool. And thank you everyone so much for coming. I hope to see you at the next Backcountry Beta.
Thanks,
Thank
Evan.
you all.
Thanks, Chloe.